afternoon. I'm Judy Woodward, the History Coordinator of the Ramsey County Library, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to this first event in our new Tuesday Scholar season. Our speaker today is Mark Bohnhorst. His topic is, what should we do about the Electoral College? Mark Bohnhorst is retired Senior Associate General Counsel of the University of Minnesota. Today's program is brought to you through the co-sponsorship of the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute of the University of Minnesota, with the financial support of the Ramsey County Library Friends organization. We are deeply grateful to both these groups. And now let me turn things over to our speaker, Mark Bohnhorst. His topic, what should we do about the Electoral College? Thank you.
Thank you, Judy. It's a real honor and privilege to be able to participate in your series. I might say I feel a little sheepish about the designation of scholar, since I worked for 24 years at the University of Minnesota with some remarkable scholars. And I've only been working for about 6 years on the Electoral College issue off and on. I don't really consider myself a complete scholar. I think you need like 10,000 hours as a nice rule of thumb to be able to claim true expertise. But let me just say this: my talk today is going to be I'm going to screen share my outline, which I believe you all have. Come on, share. There we go. Let me start with this. Most of my talk today is going to be about a law review article, Gaping Gaps in the Independent State Legislature Doctrine History, that is forthcoming in Mitchell Hamlin Law Review. My co-authors on that article are Michael Fitzgerald from St. Olaf College. He's a leading historian of Alabama Reconstruction. He's been working in that field for 40 years. And Aviam Sofer, he's been a con law scholar for 50 years and law school dean at 2 schools. So you've got 2 genuine scholars backing up what I'll be talking about most of the time today. My plan is to spend 30 minutes dealing with the shocking notion that legislatures might intervene and take away the people's right to vote in presidential elections. And then 15 minutes on the disturbing reality that we have all become accustomed to since 2000, and most recently in 2016 and almost in 2020, about how the battleground state presidential election system operates, and the national popular vote movement that has arisen to try to solve those problems. I think there are 3 problems with the Electoral College of major importance. The underlying and fundamental one is the foundations of the Electoral College in slavery and the continuing problems that the suppression of African Americans in particular has caused in our electoral system ever since. That's beyond the scope of what we'll be talking about today, what I'll be talking about. But if you want to discuss any of those issues in the Q&A period, I'll be glad to do that. There was a conference that I helped co-organize in August 2020, which actually did take up those issues. The first session was Race in the Electoral College. It was with Alexander Kazar and Jesse Wegman. Professor Kazar is a Sterling Professor of History and Public Policy at the Kennedy School, has written probably the best work on the Electoral College that I have ever read, which is Why Do We Still Have the Electoral College? 2020, I recommend it. He also wrote The Right to Vote, sort of the classic work on voting and democracy, which was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. The other participant in the 2000 conference was Jesse Wegman. He's on the editorial board of the New York Times. And he wrote in 2020, Let the People Pick the President. Again, an excellent book, and I recommend it. You've received a bibliography with these and other books listed. About half of them, I'm told, are in the collection of the Ramsey County Library, and you can access any of the others online or through interlibrary loan. So footnote 2 has my detailed outline has links to a summary of that conference and 2 supplemental resources: Race and the Electoral College, brief chronology, and links to resources on race and the Electoral College. So as I said, I'm going to try to cover 2 topics in 30 minutes and 15 minutes. There's an awful lot in this outline. It's a very detailed outline. I'm sure I'm not going to touch on everything. But as we go along, if you see things that are piqued your interest in the outline and that I don't cover, by all means raise them during the Q&A period. We'll talk about them in more depth then. So what are the other 2 problems? The other 2 big problems of the Electoral College are that state legislatures might intervene and take away the right of the people to elect. And that, well, that's the first one. Let's just talk about that. Why would one think in today's age that a legislature could come in and take away the right of the people to vote? As the state of Texas and many other litigants thought in the 2020 election, and as the mob, the insurrectionist mob on the Capitol thought might happen in some imaginary world if they could stop the counting of the actual votes. Well, the problem arises from a 1892 Supreme Court case, McPherson versus Blacker, the court's first case, and really major case on the Electoral College. That case didn't have anything to do with legislatures choosing electors. It was about whether Michigans could switch from one system of popular election to a different system of popular election. Yet, being the first case in the field, the court launched into this lengthy review of history, after which they had a conclusory paragraph stating that the review of history shows that plenary power over the appointment of electors had been, quote, conceded to state legislatures. And that is simply not true. Our Gaping Gaps article debunks that myth, and that's what we'll talk about for the next 30 minutes or so. Okay, so what is the Electoral College? Well, we all know what it is. The electors actually elect the president. The electoral votes, we don't. We elect electors. The electors elect the president. It was a construct from the Constitutional Convention. There was, I don't want to get ahead of myself, but so the language of the Constitution is, each state shall appoint in such manner as the legislature thereof may direct a number of electors, which is equal to its representation in Congress. So the question is, what does state shall appoint mean? What does legislature thereof mean? Is the legislature truly independent? Does it have truly plenary power so that it can do anything it wants? And does that power include the power simply to choose the electors itself? That's the set of questions that arises from this rather loose and conclusory language in the McPherson case, which had nothing to do at all with election through legislatures. So McPherson had made 4 major historical errors, and they involved the founding, the election of 1800, the debates in Congress from 1824 to 1826, and the simultaneous transformation of the presidential election system and Reconstruction. So McPherson said of the Constitutional Convention that basically apparently the intent of the convention was to allow legislatures to elect electors, as well as to allow for election by the people. That's simply not true. From start to finish, the central debate in the Constitutional Convention from June 1st, 1787 through September 12th, 1787 was whether, on the one hand, the national legislature would choose the president, or on the other hand, some system of popular election would be used. So the McPherson Court's hypothesis is not consistent with the record of what was actually seriously discussed. It's also not consistent with the overall historical context, which was there was widespread disagreement, concern, about the conduct of state legislatures under the Articles of Confederation. One reason we needed to move to a constitution, have a stronger government, is because the Articles of Confederation had been so dysfunctional and because of what the states had done with the power they had under the Articles. So the idea that state legislatures might be involved was considered at the Constitutional Convention. It was considered for only 1 week, and it was firmly rejected. It was rejected. The first time it was brought up, a couple of days later, the idea was brought up and was actually approved, but with no details. And the proposer would have had states limited to 4 electors each, which people quickly realized would have, in effect, meant each state had an equal vote in choosing the president. So that wasn't going to go over once they actually thought about it. And then on July 23rd, the severe concerns about the conduct of state legislatures surfaced on the question of who would be allowed to ratify, who would be called upon to ratify the convention. Would it be the people through conventions of delegates that the people elected for that specific purpose, or would it be the state legislatures? State legislatures were rejected. Edmund Randolph, an ally of Madison's, a colleague of Madison's from Virginia, railed against the fact that many legislatures were under the influence of local demagogues. So the next, and after that discussion, they said, you know what, tomorrow we're going to reconsider what we decided back on July 19th. They reconsidered it. They said, no, that's not going to happen. We're not going to have state legislatures choosing electors. And the following day, that sort of nailing the stake into the heart of this idea, Madison gave his views, which were that the legislatures had been engaged in pernicious schemes and you could not trust them with this power. So long story short, they reconsidered the whole question on August 24th. Again, the debate was between the national legislature and some system of popular election of electors lost by a single vote. People were still not satisfied with the idea of a national the national legislature choosing the president. It was referred to a committee of 11, the whole question. And one of the members of that committee revealed in 1802 exactly what happened. By his recollection, they were talking about a national legislature. He stepped in and said, no, you can't do that. The president is going to have these awesome powers that you can exercise directly on the people. If you want the people to ratify this convention, you need to let the people choose the president. Madison drafted the terms, and the terms were that the state would appoint in such manner as its legislature may direct. Its legislature, that is the state's legislature, not a legislature that is separate or apart from the state, but a legislature which is fundamentally part of the state and which, under the grammatical ideas of the day, was the possessive genitive case, which was particularly, it just highlighted the fact that the legislature is not independent of the state, it's just part of the state. The debate continued. The final drafting of the Constitution was a 5-member committee of style, elected by the convention as a whole. 4 of the members of that committee were strong proponents of popular election. And then that committee came back with its own draft, which was finally approved. Instead of its legislature, the term was legislature thereof. But looking at dictionaries, looking at of the times, looking at the grammar of the times, legislature thereof is the same thing as its legislature. The legislature is under control of the state. It's not independent from the state. And to cap it all off, Madison said on September 12th, he is to be elected by the people and for 4 years. So much for McPherson's idea that the Constitutional Convention intended the legislature to elect the president. The McPherson simply ignored ratification. There were numerous statements that the people are to elect. There was essentially no assertion that the people would not elect. It's kind of a dog that did not bark, because the anti-federalists were very concerned about preserving the rights of the people, and they wanted, constitutional amendments to be proposed to make sure that happened. The vote was very close in a number of states, and it's just inconceivable reading the ratification papers. Pauline Meyer has this wonderful book from 2010 that goes through the whole ratification in all the main states. It's just inconceivable, particularly in Massachusetts, which was early on in the process. Inconceivable that a constitution would have been ratified. People thought that the people would, delegates, if the people thought that they would not have the power to elect the electors. At least that's my read of those papers. And there's really nothing, at least in the first 11 constitutional conventions, which suggests otherwise, as far as I know. So we're on to the next, to the first 4 elections. It's really the election of 1800, which is the key election, the key error that the McPherson court made. The court said that there were many different states that did elect through their legislatures in those first 4 elections. That's fair enough. That's what the court said. It's true. But the court also asserted that no one objected to the legislative election. That's definitely not true. In the very first election, there was a major debate in Massachusetts. There was in New York, where the state Senate refused to go along with the House to have a joint session to choose the electors. And this dysfunction was such that New York appointed no electors. They could never agree on how to choose their electors that year. But a senator pointed out, if a state legislature elected 2, 3, or 4 years previously, state Senate, having people who were elected way before there was any concept of a presidential election, or who would be running in a presidential election, or what the issues are, you're going to let those people choose the electors and basically choose the president? That's outrageous. So the really fundamental issue and the fundamental mistake that McPherson made was in the election of 1800. The constitutionality of legislative election was a central issue in the election. There were major debates in New York, where first the Jeffersonian forces said, we need to change the law to let the people elect. And the New York legislature said, no, we're not going to change the law. It was the Federalist dominated legislature. And then right after that, they had an election for the new legislature. And since it was going to be the legislature that would elect rather than the people, the fact that the sitting legislature had refused to let the people elect became a huge issue in that election, and the Federalists lost, and New York ended up going 100% for Jefferson. But the contrasting piece, really the central piece of it all was with Virginia, where Virginia had gone district by district in 1796. Jefferson had lost 1 or 2 districts there. He lost a district in North Carolina or somewhere else. And he barely lost the election in 1796. So Virginia sort of led the way, saying, we've got to go winner take all, because a bunch of these states are doing winner take all, and every electoral vote might be critical. So we are going to change from our district system to a winner take all popular vote system in 1800. And before they did that, they corrected an error they had made in 1798, suggesting that states had entered the Constitution as political entities in which the legislatures might be able to withdraw from the constitutional bargain that had been struck during the ratification. And that had created quite a bit of furor, and Virginia needed to save face. And so they issued an opinion in early 1800, a report from the legislature saying state in Article 7 ratification doesn't mean the state legislatures. It means the people in their highest sovereign capacity. And then in justifying the change from state district elections to a statewide election, they issued a document, the vindication of the Virginia winner-take-all law, which became a key document in the legislative debates.
Excuse me for interrupting. There have been a number of comments asking, as you scroll up, the screen is jumping as you scroll. Is there a way to scroll, stop, scroll again, stop, so that somehow I think you're making problems for the viewers. I'm sorry, we're getting so many comments about this.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I will stop doing that. I will leave it and just move it at one time. You know.
Thank you. That would be very helpful.
Yeah, thanks for letting me know. Anyway, in March of 1800, the Jeffersonian forces issued this vindication. It's hard to find. I can't give you an online link, so I just transcribed it and put it in the index. And it basically says, you know, if state means the people and their sovereign capacity, which is what the Virginia legislature said in January of 2 or 3 months ago, then the idea that that it's unconstitutional for a state legislature to go in and come in and elect the electors is just ridiculous. It's insuperable. You can't answer that argument, because the language of the Constitution, each state shall appoint, means the people in their highest sovereign capacity shall elect in the manner that the state legislature directs. So that's kind of a key document from that election, and that election was a major point in the history of I'm losing my train of thought. It is a key illustration of the fact which major historians have affirmed, that the question of whether state means the people, as opposed to whether it means the legislature, was a major issue in the election of 1800, which means that McPherson got the election of 1800 exactly backwards. And actually in Virginia, what they did and the way they did it shows that Virginia was a practical application, that the home of the author of the Declaration, the father of the Constitution, and 3 US presidents for the next 24 years, the practical application of that state and those leaders was that that legislative election was probably unconstitutional. So I'm going to skip over this interlude. I see time is slipping away here. So the next major, sorry, I was jumping again. 1824 to 1826, McPherson missed these debates entirely. In 1824, there were 7 states electing by their legislatures. In January, February, Thomas Hart Benton gave a major speech, a 3-day speech, basically recycling arguments that had been made in the 18 teens, that this was wrong, that the legislative election was unconstitutional. He himself had been from Missouri, and Missouri had its votes not counted in the 1820 election because it was violating the rights of the people to settle, of African Americans to settle in Missouri, and kind of skirting around the Missouri Compromise. So there's a huge controversy in Missouri with the result that electoral votes were not counted. And Benton said, if we have these usurpations of the rights of the people, maybe we just won't count your electoral votes. This created a huge furor within 2 years. The number of states that had that elected by their legislatures had dropped from 7 to 2. So there was basically a transformation of the system as a result at that time. And again, McPherson completely missed this. Skipping forward to Reconstruction, the main points are the as of 1832, South Carolina was the only state that still elected through its legislature. In 1865, it repudiated that idea. Madison's notes of the Constitutional Convention had been published in 1840, and if you read those, before those notes were published, it wouldn't be entirely clear to anybody what the Constitutional Convention had actually intended. But by 1865, that was pretty clear. So in the state constitutional convention, the governor said that the former practice had been a gross error and had been a usurpation. The following year, Section 2 of the 14th Amendment was passed by Congress on the last day of the discussion in the Senate. They changed the language of Section 2 to provide that it explicitly applied to elections for presidential electors. They did that for the specific reason of making sure that the problems of the actions of South Carolina, of states such as, that states could not follow the example of South Carolina ever again. The result of Section 2 is that if people are not allowed to participate in elections, then the states lose a proportionate amount of representation of population in calculating how many representatives they have. So if you disallow about 100% of your population from participating in a presidential election, you go from whatever your current membership in the House is down to 1, which is the minimum. So you lose power in the House, you lose electoral votes. It's just totally impossible politically to deprive the people of the right to vote in presidential elections. These issues circulated again in 1868. Florida and Alabama and other states in the South were faced with white supremacist terror. In July, the representatives of the newly admitted states arrived in the Capitol, and some radical Republicans there said, you know what, one way to deal with this terror in the South is to just have the legislatures choose the electors. So Florida did that. In 3 days, the bill was introduced and it was signed. Alabama started down that same path. There was a huge national furor. The governor vetoed the bill. And I think that in retrospect, the overall lesson from that is that the nation is committed to the election by a popular vote, come what may. And that lesson carried over into 1869, when a 16th Amendment, a very simple amendment, obtained wide bipartisan support in the Senate. Now remember, all the other Civil War amendments, the 13th, 14th, 15th, were passed entirely with Republican votes, were urged on by radical Republicans, were negotiated between radical Republicans and more moderate Republicans. It was entirely a one-sided show. But the 16th Amendment had strong bipartisan support. It was supported by the lead Republican, one of the radical Republican leaders in the Senate, who was trying to get the strongest 15th Amendment that he could, because he said, if we pair the 15th Amendment, which was controversial, some parts of it were highly controversial, if we pair that with this incredibly popular 16th Amendment, which then the 15th Amendment might help the 15th Amendment get through, and it might help me probably in negotiations with the House to get the strongest, the 15th Amendment drafted that I can. That effort failed, but the essence of it was in fact sort of the epitome, the proof positive, if you will, that the idea that the people shall elect is just super popular. It's the fundamental nature of American democracy. How could anybody disagree with that? The amendment was very simple. It just said in the first line, the people shall elect the president, and it left the initial power in the states to propose what's particular types of elections. But then it said Congress shall have the power to determine the manner of elections. Very, very simple. And yet it goes to the fundamental nature of the problem with our whole election system, which I will turn to next. I'm going to skip over. I'm sorry, I'm doing bumpy things again. I'm going to skip over the election of 1876, 77, because that's not all that central to the question of state legislatures choosing electors. And I'm also going to skip over what should we do here, because that is redundant from what I'm going to say at the very end of the talk. So we're proceeding now to part two, dysfunctional battleground states and the national popular vote movement. The key points here are what's in my outline is simply a brief overview of issues that have circulated endlessly ever since 1813, when the whole idea of amending the Constitution to deal with the Electoral College was supercharged when the North Carolina legislature refused to let its people elect in the 1812 election. What we have now, of course, is the battleground state system. All the energy is in a handful of states that will decide the results of the election. The vast majority of people's votes don't even count. And the result, you can get wrong way winners, as we saw in 2000 and 2016, where somebody loses the national popular vote, wins the Electoral College vote. The outcomes can be essentially random and arbitrary. A change of about 50,000 votes in 2020 would have changed the result, and Biden, who won by 7 million votes, would have lost. That's just appalling. What kind of an electoral system is that? So the national popular vote movement, there's an article, the article from January, or the paper from January 27th, 2019 that was sent out. In that paper, I discussed the foundations of the national popular vote movement. They're basically two strategic concepts that would emerge in 2016. Dean Robert Bennett at Northwestern had studied the history and studied the issues for 5 years. He recommended a strategy of following along after the 17th Amendment, which secured the right to vote for senators. And in that era, late 1890s through the early 1910s, states experimented widely, and a national consensus was developed with a fair amount of experimentation. And Bennett thought that was the way to go, and he did strongly. He identified the interstate compact approach as one of the viable options that should be pursued. The dominant role, beginning in 2006 up to today, has been the national popular vote interstate compact. It's a compact is provided. The concept of the mechanism is provided in the Constitution. The interstate compact will go into effect when states with 270 electoral votes have all signed it. The strategy has been sort of single-minded pursuit of the interstate compact, and not much interest in considering any alternatives. You've got your excellent solution, pursue that solution, and it has really dominated the whole field ever since 2006. My own view is the interstate compact is fine in principle. I discussed that in the January 2019 article. I dispense with or answer a lot of the objections that have been raised in conservative quarters. I think it's fine. The problem is it's wholly partisan. It's perceived as being wholly partisan. There were early successes, and then but Republican support has collapsed. It seems. Will there be any Republican senator or representative who sponsors a bill this year? I think it's doubtful. So what should we do with all of this? Got about 6 or 7 minutes to spin out some suggestions, and then we can open it up to questions. One approach is to continue to support the national popular vote interstate compact approach if it is politically viable. I learned about let's see, I saw the Clean Elections Minnesota memo, email this morning. This has been added to their priority list for the 2023 session. So they're going to pursue it. I imagine legal women voters and others will pursue it. I think that's fine. I don't think it should be pursued to the exclusion of everything else, however. I think given the level of partisanship that we're experiencing, I think it's going to be a long time before the impact of the compact gets adopted, most likely. And it's time to consider other approaches. That was my view in 2019, and it continues to be my view today. As I suggested before, I think the proposed 16th Amendment indicates is a path toward a constitutional amendments that should be taken very seriously. And I hope those who are studying the question of what kind of constitutional amendment should we think about supporting, should take would take a close look at that and at that history. Professor Fitzgerald and I are working on revising a manuscript that we have submitted to a history journal that goes into that at great depth. And so there will be some additional information that would be helpful to those who might be considering a 16th Amendment approach sometime in the foreseeable future. The leading concepts of constitutional amendment, the ones that have passed with a 2/3 vote at some point since 1820, are the district system, the national in 1820, the national popular vote system in 1969 or so with the Birch Buy, the Lodge Gossett system, which was a system of proportional representation, which sailed through the Senate. I think it was in 1950, but then got stopped when people realized that with the suppression of the Black vote in the South, it was going to be it was just going to be a gift to segregationists in the South, and it's going to set back the cause of civil rights by 30 years. That's an example of how racial issues have just really infected our system and our ability to do anything to solve our problems. So there are those three plus the 1869 16th Amendment. The question is, should you just, well, first of all, should you consider a district system? I got an email from Kazar a day or two ago saying, no, you should not even consider a district system. We've got gerrymandering problems. Proportional representation, as in the Lodge Gossett bill, is way better anyway. So I think you should not, my recommendation would be a national constitutional amendment that explicitly prohibits a districting system on a national basis. And how to do the rest, I'm not sure. How do you prevent Congress from playing political games is this concern that came up over the years, over the centuries. as these questions were being debated. I would suggest that if you give Congress the power to implement a change, that you say that the current Congress, you have to wait at least 2 years before a change becomes effective. So the idea is the people shall elect, Congress shall have the power to say, to specify the manner in which the people elect, but any bill any law that Congress passes, the president signs, will not take an effect for at least 2 years. One thought would be specify a proportional representation system, which is it's not perfect, but it's pretty good. And it may be more politically viable than a national popular vote, because each state would retain the small states would retain their 2 Senate boost. You specify that and say, but national popular vote, which is highly controversial, it has been, you have to wait at least 1 cycle or another 2 cycles before Congress could go that far, in order to pull the political sting out of the whole issue. That's what Madison was recommending in the 1820s. So wait a cycle before, do what you think is right, but wait a cycle before it's actually implemented. It's what Madison recommended in 1869, or in 1789, about Congress raising its own salary. The first amendment actually that was proposed was that you have to wait a Congress before an increase in salary becomes effective. That was the first amendment. And it turned out there was no limitation on the time that you could for ratification. And it was finally ratified and became the 27th Amendment, like hundreds of years later. So anyway, the idea of dealing with political issues by delaying the effectiveness of changes 1 cycle is, I think, a pretty sound idea. That's one way to help it deal with some of these political issues. Another thought that I sort of was, I'm sorry, it's kind of a nervous tick. I keep running this up and down. I'll stop doing that. I'll put my hands together here. But 2 other things, I think state constitutional amendments are something that are worth seriously considering. How could one not want your state constitution to say the people shall elect the president? How do you oppose that? Let's look for opportunities for genuine, where we can agree. And, a red state, a blue state, a purple state, how could you oppose that? And that then makes the nature, our constitutions are supposed to set out our fundamental principles and our fundamental values. It seems like, it seems almost too simple, and yet it's so fundamentally important to say what we believe in and what we stand for. So that's a way to get the whole idea that the people shall elect cemented into U.S. law and cemented into U.S. consciousness. And it's really a repudiation of this whole independent state legislature doctrine idea, and a repudiation of the idea that you can play games in order to stand between the people and their votes and the person who is elected. And then one last idea is we should have a clean Electoral Count Act amendment. I think what was done at the end of the last Congress with Senator Klobuchar's leadership is good. It's very positive. It's not complete. It only prevents hijinks from being played from the point that votes are cast thereafter. It doesn't prevent a state legislature from passing a bill prior to election day, which can have, in effect, undermine well, it might even give the legislature the power to intervene after election day. It's not clear. Section 2 of the 14th Amendment, I think, gives Congress the power to say cleanly, we are not going to count votes from states where the legislatures deny or in any way abridge the right of the people to vote in presidential elections. I think going back to 1787, that was the intent of Congress when they created the electoral vote in the first place. that language is ambiguous. The language of Section 2 of the 14th Amendment is not very ambiguous. The Congress has that power, and they should just say cleanly, no, we're not going to count those votes if you try to do something like that. So, okay, that's about 46 minutes by my count. And I skipped over a lot of detail, but that's fine. The whole point is to open it up to a conversation prompted by your questions. If you give me just a second, I'm going to grab some water. I'll be right back.
And while Mark Bohnhorst is getting a drink of water, I'm going to just mention that thank you very much to one of our audience members who noted that Lori Sturdivant, who I will mention parenthetically, will be a future Tuesday Scholar speaker. She'll be speaking in a couple of months. She is the retired editorial page editor, I believe, of the Star Tribune. In any case, she did an interview a couple of days ago with Patrick Rosenstiel, the Minnesotan who is the national chair of the National Popular Vote Compact, which Mark Bohnhorst has been talking about. I'm going to put a link to that interview into the chat line for anyone who's interested. And now, Mark, if you're ready to take questions, I will begin. We do have a number of questions in the Q&A line already. I believe we have room for a few more. So if I'll say to the audience, now is your chance to raise your voice and ask the questions of our speaker, Mark Bohnhorst. I'm going to give myself the privilege of the first question. This is something I've wondered about for a while. Lately, you hear elements, particularly on the right, saying the United States is not a democracy. It's a phallus. It's fallacious to think of the United States as a democracy. It's a republic. I had no idea what that meant. Are they referring perhaps to this issue of popular electoral, popular vote for the presidency?
It is one of the lines of argument that comes up. The United States is a democratic republic. It's a representative form of government. In that sense, it is a Republican form of government, but it's a representative government in which the people elect their representatives, and therefore it's a democracy as well. That's the best answer. The idea of democracy versus republic goes back to ideas of the founding, where they were saying, well, a democracy is like direct democracy, where the people vote on everything. And obviously we are not a direct democracy, although the idea of initiative and referendum has been around for a very long time, actually, longer than some people recognize. The oldest constitution in the world, written constitution, is not the US Constitution. It's the Constitution of the state of Massachusetts from 1780. And that constitution a draft was first created by the legislature, and the people voted it down, in part because it wasn't the people who had created the Constitution. It's the people who are to ordain and establish the constitutions. So they had this idea, the same system that was used to ratify, well, a similar system that was used to ratify the US Constitution was used to create the Massachusetts Constitution. They had elections of people, of individual delegates for a single purpose, to meet and propose a constitution. And then that constitution went back to be a referendum by the people, the vote of the people as to whether or not they wanted to ordain and establish that constitution. So it's not, yeah. So anyway, enough of that.
Okay, I will start the questions in the Q&A line. I think the first one you may have addressed this, but perhaps you have more to say on it. If National Popular Vote, NPV, if NPV happens, do state legislators have the power constitutionally to override the majority of voters in their own state?
Okay, let me see. I get it. So if you have a national popular vote that's created by the action of the legislatures who have passed a law saying that we are going to cast our electoral votes based on the national vote, And that law would mean that even if the state's own voters voted for candidate X, the electoral votes would go to candidate Y. So in that sense, the state legislature would be overriding the wishes of its own voters as to who should be elected president. I guess that's kind of the long and the short of it. Yeah, I think they do have that constitutional authority under the compact clause, interstate compact clause. States can agree with one another as to how they are going to conduct their business. Yeah, I think that constitutional authority is there.
All right. The next question deals with the case currently before the Supreme Court, Moore versus Harper. And for those of you like me who didn't know what Moore versus Harper is, it has to do with the gerrymandering, alleged gerrymandering of the North Carolina legislative map. And that question is before the Supreme Court right now. Would you want to talk about that? What will happen if the Supreme Court affirms the right of state legislatures to select electors?
Okay, so the issue in front of in Moore versus Harper isn't about electors. The actual issue is about Congress and and it's about gerrymandering.
Yeah.
And it would depend on what how the court frames its holding. I've read all of the briefs, just an immense number of amicus briefs on both sides. I listened to the oral argument. I think there's good hope to believe the court will not go that in the direction that many people fear. But a worst case scenario, the court would say the legislatures were intended to operate as independent entities, freed from their state constitutions, freed from any authority of the court, to interpret their constitutions in a way that would require that, and therefore overturn state laws that the court considered invalid. There are a couple of points in my outline and in the article that unfortunately are not in the briefs, any of the briefs, but that I think cut strongly against that. One is in the 1876-1877 case, where this is a huge meltdown in the presidential election, they formed a commission, an electoral commission with 5 justices and 5 senators and 5 representatives to try to adjudicate the matter. There were two questions raised there that directly raised. One, do state constitutions matter under Article 2? And number 2, do state Supreme Courts get to interpret what their constitutions say? In both cases, the court ruled, or the commission ruled, directly contrary to the views of the independent state legislature doctrine. They said constitutions do matter, and state courts, whatever they say before the electoral votes are cast, that governs. The state courts get to interpret their own constitutions and apply the state law prior to the time of the election. And then the other is this idea of legislature thereof. There's a lot of discussion of the word legislature, but that's not what the Constitution says. It says legislature thereof, which means the legislature that is controlled by, whose source is the state, i.e. the people of the state who ordain and establish their constitutions. So the idea that a state court should not be able to look at a law and say this violates fundamental principles of justice. You go back to the Constitutional Convention, the middle of July, 1787. Randolph, whom the plaintiffs in Moore v. Harper tout in their brief, he says that there should be federal court jurisdiction to oversee state legislation and overturn any legislation that violates principles of equity and justice. That's the same legal standard that the North Carolina Supreme Court applied in Moore v. Harper. Again, unfortunately, that's not cited in any of the Supreme Court briefs. But yeah, so if they rule that state legislatures are these independent entities and that they're not subject to regulation by their own constitutions, we definitely need a constitutional amendment.
There are a number of questions really that are asking about the Supreme Court in the last couple of years has taken a sharp turn to the conservative side. And there are a number of questions now. Can you predict the impact of the far right thinking of the Supreme Court should questions of national popular vote, should they come in form of a legal question before the Supreme Court?
It's really hard, to my mind, to predict that. On one hand, it's sort of the far right, or the Federalist Society scholars and law review articles and so on that are attacking the national popular vote interstate compact. So it's those law clerks that are that populate the chambers of those justices. The law clerks have been seeped in that stuff when they were in law school. Who've been writing those, who've been editing those law review articles and so on and so forth. On the other hand, the national popular vote interstate compact concept is deeply conservative. It's rooted in the idea that the state legislatures get to decide. And in a sense of, if they have plenary authority, then they should have authority to decide that their electoral votes will be cast in favor of the winner of the national popular vote. So it's impossible for me to predict, but those are I see as the competing tensions.
Yeah, I see. Okay. What qualifications does an elector need in order to be appointed? Is this an honorary payback for, political services? Who becomes an elector?
It's entirely at the discretion of the campaigns. The campaigns identified their electors. There are certain disqualifications. You can't be a member of Congress or have a position of trust or profit from the U.S. government. There are one or two very limited disqualifications, but otherwise anybody can be an elector. And I think, I haven't really studied this, but I believe that the campaigns typically, being an elector is kind of an honorary result of having been a long and valued contributor to the party of that candidate.
Why are people against abolishing the Electoral College?
Ooh.
There's a simple answer, a simple question for you. Get straight to the heart of things.
Politics.
Yeah.
No, that's a very long and complicated question. There's a voluminous body of literature on these topics. Again, my January 27th, 2019 article sort of surveys the variety of arguments and answers. I think most of them or all of them. So in terms of legal arguments, we could talk for an hour and a half about
Is
why
there a short answer to this question? Is there any short answer to the question?
Well, I think there's a sense that this is such a major change in how we do things that it should not, that this workaround is like an end run around normal constitutional processes. That's kind of the intuitive argument, I think.
Sure.
And you don't make that kind of it's just too clever by half would be the argument.
I see. Okay, the next questioner wants you to talk a little bit more about the significance of battleground states. What is the impact of the concentration on battleground states in our national elections?
Sure. Well, with the winner-take-all system, inevitably there are going to be a bunch of states which are clearly going to be red or blue, and there are others where the margins are much smaller. And so the election is not going to turn on the population as a whole. It's going to turn on those states that have small margins. So those are by definition the battleground states. And the problem is, when you want to win the election, you're going to put all of your resources into those races that are actually going to matter. So it's like, there are maps of, you can see the National Popular Vote website, National Popular Vote.org website. There's lots and lots of materials about this, but you can see where almost all the events occur in only a few states. Almost all the money goes to only a few states. The vast majority of voters don't matter. If you're in a red state, it doesn't matter whether you're conservative or liberal. You might as well not vote in the presidential election in terms of, for all the good it's going to do in the outcome. So it just really skews things in ways that just ignore the vast. Every vote is not equal, and then because everything turns on results in states which are very close, the result, the election can be influenced by just arbitrary factors. In just a few states, if only 50,000, I think I said this already, but if only 50,000 votes had changed in three or four states in 2020, Trump would have been reelected. 7 million votes, 50,000 votes. Why should an election be decided by 50,000 votes instead of 7 million votes? It's just quite arbitrary. It just doesn't feel fair or right.
You had talked earlier about an election. I think it was the election in the 1830s when the Missouri votes were excluded. And this questioner wants you to go into a little more depth. Why was that again? Could you talk about that?
Be glad to. So the Missouri Compromise allowed Missouri to come into the Union. I think at the same time Maine joined. There was no exclusion. They were able to join the Union without anything said one way or the other about slavery, but it was understood that they were going to authorize slavery in their constitution, and they did, of course. But they also said in their constitution that no free African American could settle in the state. So that goes against the idea that we get to move around the nation as we wish if we are citizens of the nation. Yeah, the privileges and immunities to travel I think were spelled out in the Articles of Confederation, for goodness sakes. So the Northerners were just outraged by this. They said this violates the unenumerated rights of people. Under the 9th Amendment says unenumerated rights, which are nonetheless rights, will not be denied or disparaged. Well, I mean, I don't know that they quoted the 9th Amendment, but that's the concept. So Congress refused to admit them. They went ahead and held their election, and the electoral votes were presented. And the question was what to do. Well, the brilliant compromiser Henry Clay came up with the idea that, we will open the votes, we will say what they are, and we will announce the results both ways, and we will say it doesn't matter, and therefore the president is elected. So that's how that happened. And to me, it's a wonderful example of how the violation of fundamental rights, even if they are not specified, with exactitude, could be a basis for Congress not to count votes. If it's really this is basic principle that has been trampled upon, then we might not count your votes. And that's basically what Benton then said in 1824. He was reinventing himself as a big pro-democrat. He had been, the first 2 years in the Senate, he'd been sort of the minion of the elites in Missouri, but now he's reinventing himself as a Jacksonian Democrat. So it's like, oh, you're going to screw around with the people to vote. Yeah, we might not count your votes. And when he gave his speech, Missouri's law was that the legislature would elect. That was the way they came in the Constitution. And then 3 or 4 months later, we're going to change the law. So his speech probably had some impact in Missouri, where he was a leading politician.
The next questioner wonders whether proportional representation, the possible system of voting, how would this affect the problem that we're considering today? And could you just briefly describe what proportional representation involves?
Yeah, be glad to. So under the Lodge Gossett proportional representation idea, Bucklew, one of the founders, one of the supporters of the 16th Amendment, the chief author would also support that, is the states retain the same number of electoral votes as they have now. So the small states still get their 2-vote advantage. But you do away with the office of elector. So you have a number of, quote, electoral votes, not electors, who can only vote one way with 1 vote. And then you count up all the votes and you award electoral votes for your state in proportion to the percentage of the vote total. So you could get 15.7 electoral votes in California or something. So it's a precise match for each state of the degree of support in that state for the various candidates. And then you add up all those electoral votes, and so it's not a national popular vote. The 2-vote, bonus skews it a little bit, and there are other little factors that skew it a bit. But it's a pretty good match, and it's vastly better than the district system, as I think I mentioned already. And it was sailing through the Senate in 1950, and then oops, it's going to mess around with civil rights. We can't do that now. But now that we have many of the restrictions on voting basically overturned, it's a pretty reasonable system. And it politically, it has the advantage that people who are concerned about losing that 2-vote advantage, well, you retain the 2-vote advantage.
Okay. All right. Next is a comment. Says you can oppose the people electing the president and I think this addresses your comment, who could oppose free, representational election of the president.
Yeah,
this person says you can oppose the people electing the president if you're a politician who cares more about power than about the country's welfare and future. So you want to comment on that?
Yeah, well, if 90% of the people who are going to elect you think the people ought to be able to elect, you won't be a politician very long. If you say, no, I don't think that's what the Federalists did in 1800. The big issue is, are we going to have popular election, or are we going to, and they started trying to defend the elitism that, the legislature's no better than the people. Man, they got their head handed to them in a platter. So we discussed this. Okay, that's enough.
Okay. What's your best guess for which of the following has the best chance of passing, of coming into being the earliest? National Popular Vote Compact or a constitutional amendment? And then a kind of depressing follow-up. Will any of the people listening today still be alive when either of these are passed?
Yeah, I don't know. That's my best guess. I mean, people have given up on the idea of a constitutional amendment for such a long time that, building a movement from scratch, basically, it would be a daunting prospect. On the other hand, the polarization and rejection of the compact in conservative quarters, it's hard to see how that can go anywhere. Back in 2017, 2019, I was really urging people to use initiative. There was some pushback from National Popular Vote Organization on that. And we've continued conversations, and it looks like, if theoretically you could get it passed by initiative in Florida and Ohio and Missouri and so on, get the people to believe that it was not the devil incarnates method to destroy American democracy. But there's so much the power of propaganda and misinformation and negative, the appeal of negative messages. I don't know that it's possible to go into a reddish state and win an initiative.
Can a national popular vote be integrated in any way with the electoral college concept? Is this possible? or actually this questioner says, how can a national popular vote be integrated with the Electoral College concept? And I'll add, is that possible?
Is that possible? Yeah, it would be possible. So my imagined constitutional amendment, you'd keep the electoral vote system as it is. Maybe you'd say Congress can use any system it wants other than districting in the first election or in the second election. But in the third election after, Congress shall have power to require that all electors cast their ballots for the winner of the national popular vote. So Congress could say it shall be national popular vote, even though we keep the electoral system in place, which makes sense because if something happens and it turns out the national popular vote doesn't really work and there's a better system, then you still have the electoral structure there. So Congress could then go back and implement some other system that uses the electoral vote structure.
Okay. This questioner, well, we've talked about how electoral college electors are chosen, but this questioner also says in 2020, who were Minnesota's electors and how were they chosen? Do you know anything specific about the people involved in Minnesota in 2020?
I do not know who they are. I'm sure they were chosen by the campaign, by the Biden campaign, in consultation with the Democratic Party.
Yeah. Okay. I'm not quite, I don't really understand this question, so I think I'm going to just read it out and perhaps you understand better than I do. Are you saying that all states vote according to the national popular vote? If so, are you willing to give your vote up to New York and California? I don't think that is what you're saying, but perhaps you would be able to answer that more fully than I.
Yeah, I don't think I understand the question.
Maybe the questioner would want to clarify your question and we'll read it again. Okay, there is the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. And what are the specific components of that?
It's relatively simple. I don't have it in front of me. But it provides that I could find it pretty quickly, but
well, I can just read the first line. It's an agreement among the group of U.S. states and the District of Columbia to award all their electoral votes to whichever presidential ticket wins the overall popular vote in the 50 states and the District of Columbia. It's a way of, yeah.
That's it. I mean, there are about 7 or 8, maybe more sub parts that explain in more detail how it works operationally. But that's the essence of it.
Okay. Sure. You alluded to the impact of slavery on the electoral process in our nation since the beginning. Would you want to elaborate just a little bit on that? This questioner would like to know exactly what's involved there.
Okay, well, so the starting problem was the compromise, the 3/5 compromise, so that the South was able to count as part of its population in the representation, the count of population for the representation in the House of Representatives, 3/5 of their slaves. So that gave the South extra power in the House of Representatives. It was not not in proportion to those who were able to vote. And then that carried over into the Electoral College. So other than the 2 Adams, every president up to Lincoln was a slaveholder. In the election of 1800, it may or may not be true, but the Federalists said that Jefferson was carried into the White House on the backs of slaves, i.e. on the backs of the votes that came out of the South that were awarded to the South because of slavery. So yeah, going forward, then after the Civil War, all of a sudden the South had 5/5 instead of 3/5 of a slave being counted toward their population. Now slavery was abolished and Now they had full representation for all the ex-slaves.
Yes.
And if they could suppress those votes, they had even more electoral power than they had before.
Mhm.
So it took some time. And Reconstruction was part of struggle over trying to assure the right of the blacks to vote in the South. That's, you know, a major issue during Reconstruction. And in some states, for some time, there was not an immediate disaster, you know. But by 1890, the southern states were revising their constitutions and coming up with all kinds of systems to exclude blacks. So yeah, that was just disastrous. I have a fellow researcher who wrote a paper on the unconstitutional election of 1916. That there had been, by that point, there had been a wholesale exclusion of blacks in the South. And under Section 2 of the 14th Amendment, the representation in the South and the electoral votes of the South should have been, if the 14th Amendment had been implemented, should have been cut drastically. And Woodrow Wilson, who was a Southern racist segregationist, would have lost the election of 1916.
Yeah.
And then I've already mentioned Lodge Gossett. I mean, proportional representation is a much better system than we have now, but that became impossible in 1950 when it was proposed.
Yeah.
Because of the effects that I've already talked about.
The next questioner seems to get at the sort of conservative argument for maintaining the Electoral College simply because we've always had the Electoral College. Is there a concern with a national vote that certain states might hijack the election with their crazy procedures? It seems to me that the Electoral College, to some degree, limits the potential hijacking of an election. Would you want to comment on that?
Well, we now have in law the principle of universal suffrage. That's in Section 2 of the 14th Amendment. Actually, it was in law as of 1868, and if you screw around with procedures, you can lose. And we've got it in, you know, in statutes all over. I'm not sure what crazy procedures could hijack the national popular vote. What we have now are crazy. We have an incredibly fragile system right now, where a few votes in a few states can change the result. So what we have now is the height of a system in which crazy procedures can change the result. For example, in 2000, when George Bush's brother, Governor Bush, went through and combed the registration rolls. You know, how many tens of thousands of black votes or Democratic votes were culled out in that process?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Okay. Here's a very interesting question. This person says, I am a retired election official, and I am curious what might happen in the case of a close, a very close, or a tied election. If we had the national popular vote process, would the entire nation be put into a recount? And what would be the practical consequences of something like that?
Well, there's been a lot of written about that. I discuss it in the January 2019 paper. The likelihood of a need for a recount in a national vote is vastly smaller than the likelihood of a need for a recount in a state-by-state vote. There's just so much more likelihood. I mean, the state, under the battleground state system, the election turns on votes in closely divided states. So again and again, you run into the risk that one of those closely divided states is going to be so close that, you know, you're going to require a recount. So that's one sort of answer. The other thing is, recounting's become pretty efficient. You know, we've had amazing numbers of recounts and amazing effectiveness. People like your caller or the questioner, they and their tens of thousands of colleagues around the country, you know, they're the backbone of our election system. And with all the work that's been done on getting recounts right and getting them done quickly. Yeah, to me, I'm not an expert on this, but to me, it's less of a threat than it might have been 20 years ago.
Okay. We have about 10 more minutes, and I must say we have as many questions open in the Q&A line as we did at the beginning of this
Oh, no.
process, which no, that's very good because it means people are really engaged in the talk. So I'm going to apologize in advance to anyone whose question I do not get to. And I think if we just push forward, we'll try to answer as many questions as possible. But before that, I'm going to ask this question that has come up. For 100 and what, about 130 years, 125 years, the Electoral College was a non-issue because there were no elections where the popular vote didn't prevail. Now, since the year 2000, we've had 2 such elections. What's changed? What's different? What happened?
People have studied that. I know some statistical gurus have looked at the forces that are affecting the country right now, and their projections are it's going to be even more common in the future. So I mean, we've just become so polarized, and our political science capabilities have allowed us, the parties, to focus so exquisitely on key constituencies and to be able to, arrange the system to try to win. I don't know. It's just, I don't know why, but people who have studied it deeply say this is not a problem that's going to go away.
Yeah. All right. Would national popular vote, NPV, would it have an impact if the following questions were not also addressed? And the questioner refers to the 2-party system exercising supreme control over candidate selection, the issue of campaign finance, and the issue of truth in advertising, meaning propaganda hiding under the banner to free speech or freedom of the press. Those are 3 big issues, but I think what this person is getting at is, could we have a solution with NPV without addressing these other issues as well?
I think any solution is a partial solution. There are just a host of challenges to our democratic system. Those are certainly among the top ones. So no, it's not a magic bullet to solve our problems, but it has its own set of problems that should be addressed on their own merits, I think.
Yeah. Okay, this questioner has read the sign behind you, which asks, why do we still have the Electoral College? I think that's the title of one of the books, right?
Yeah, that's Kazar's great book.
Okay, but it says that it seems that our conversation today has been how to manage the Electoral College, not to consider doing away with it and to move to simple popular vote. Do you think that's a fair assessment?
I don't think that's what I'm intending. I mean, I'm thinking that we need to look at a range of options to get from here to a national popular vote. And going straight from here to a national popular vote might not be as feasible as going through an intermediate phase, such as a proportional system in which we keep the basic structure.
Okay, all right. Young people say that their votes do not matter, so why vote? I think this follows from the significance of battleground states and the electoral vote system. So changing the electoral vote system is crucial to increasing people's willingness to participate in elections at all. Do you agree?
Yes, I do agree. That's one of the criticisms of the current system, is it depresses turnout greatly in states that don't matter.
Yeah, okay. The House of Representatives is supposed to be proportional to the population, but it is growing more and more tilted towards states with small populations. the US Senate is already tilted towards states with small populations. What is your opinion? Well, first of all, do you agree that the House of Representatives is becoming more disproportional? And what is your opinion on increasing the size of the House of Representatives to address this issue, if it is indeed an issue?
Yeah, I have not studied the issue. I don't know that the first premise that it's becoming tilted towards smaller states is actually true.
Mm-hmm.
I suppose it might be to a minor extent, but it's not an issue that is top of mind for me.
Okay. All right. Here's a comment an answer to a previous question. DFL electors in 2020 were chosen, that is, elected at the state convention. And for anyone who is interested, if you go to ballotpedia.org, you can find the names of the Electoral College members from Minnesota. So if anyone is interested, I can put Ballotpedia in the chat line. Yeah, there's an answer from the question, from the audience for one of those questions. Let's see, using the national popular vote skews the impact to large states, doesn't it? As they sway the national vote. States like New York and California. I guess the question is, oh, this is the same person who had asked an earlier question about this, and I had asked the questioner to rephrase the question. So under national popular vote, would states like New York and California assume even more power proportionate to other states when it comes to the impact of their votes, because they are so large and so populous?
No, under national popular vote, the unit of measure is each voter. Each voter is equal, regardless of what state they're in. And when you move from New York to North Dakota, you retain exactly the same equal power. Everybody in the nation is equal.
But since people in New York generally don't move to North Dakota, and they have very different values and concerns than people in North Dakota, doesn't it in effect give an advantage to the more populous states like New York?
Only because they have more people. It's because every person is equal. If every person is equal, the states that have more people will have more votes counted. It's all about all men and women are created equal and should be the consent of the governed, everybody equally. That determines the government. I should just add, I'm willing to answer in writing some of the questions if we run out of time.
Okay, and we are about to run out of time. I would ask Grayson behind the scenes, maybe you could save some of the questions that we were not able to get to. And I'm afraid we are out of time. In fact, we are down to the very wire here. So I want to thank you very much, Mark Bohnhorst, for a very interesting opening lecture to our new series. Thank you very much to the audience. As always, I always count on you to come up with really interesting, thought-provoking questions, and you never let me down. Thank you to our behind-the-scenes people from OLLI, Grayson, and Carmi. I really appreciate your work. Please, everyone, I hope we'll see you next week when we're going to have Professor John Butler on a kind of sorry episode of Minnesota's history from the 1930s, battling Minnesota's anti-Semites in the Hitler years. Should be very interesting, but for today, we're going to say goodbye and thank you all very much.